had a nice couple weeks off from doing the show. Saw a lot of movies, saw a lot of family, and that included the complete unknown, a Bob Dylan movie in theaters. Who would think when Christmas, the holiday season, when you're supposed to be watching holiday movies and things full of tinsel, that Bob Dylan would be the subject that Hollywood would go after. But alas, that was the big. Excuse me, let me mute this. That was the big holiday premiere this year, starring Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan, Ed Norton as Pete Seeger, and Elle Fanning as Sylvia Russo in this new depiction of him. I really feel like Hollywood has entered an era that has been very clear to them for a long time. After about 7 generations of doing superhero films, there must have been a meeting somewhere that said, we can't do the 5th Iron Man. We can't do Captain America 14, wherever they are. They said superheroes are done. And they looked into the ether, into the atmosphere, and said, what is the next thing that we can tackle? And somebody must have piped up at the meeting and said, hey, you know what we can do? We can do movies about musicians, because this seems to be the next era of constant drip feed movie into your veins about the next big pop star. I mean, we've seen this depiction happen to Queen, which I believe Rami Malek played Freddie Mercury. We've seen this now with Elton John. There's a rumored Beatles biopic coming up, and so Bob Dylan was obviously the next one to really get this treatment. I believe there's a Paul Simon and Garfunkel movie that's even rumored to be going around. I know that there was a stage play at one point in the background, but this is the new superhero movie genre that we might be destined to be sick of in 5 years. And this is the next installment, Bob Dylan. And to be honest, the movie itself, I wouldn't necessarily call it a triumph. I think it's a very, very long, drawn-out film. I enjoyed myself as much as I can enjoy the same kind of formula that a lot of these music movies tend to have. And if you've seen the Elvis picture, which was another one of their ones that came out a couple years ago by Baz Luhrmann, this one follows very much the same kind of storyline, if you will, right? Musician kind of is from the grassroots. He gets kind of discovered, and eventually his music gets so big there tends to be opposition from management when he wants to evolve. Now, with Elvis and the story of Baz Luhrmann, we know that's typically kind of what happens, but there's also a predictable and understanding that we also know that Elvis's story leads to his ultimate demise, right? His relationship with Colonel Parker kind of deteriorates over time, and Elvis eventually ends up passing away. And so that inherent tragedy is running through that film, right? We know that they don't have to dramatize anything because the drama is already kind of built into the actual thread of the plot. With Bob Dylan, it really felt like they were concocting drama because there might not have been that much opposition at the time. And a lot of people would say, maybe, you didn't grow up in that era, and I'd say you're correct. But it's hard for a current viewer to look at the circumstances of the movie and understand why this is such a big deal. And what I'm talking about is in 1965 when Bob Dylan wants to evolve, right? When he seems to evolve from freewheeling Bob Dylan, all acoustic numbers on that album, and he wants to introduce electric music to the Newport Folk Festival. Pete Seeger and management and others who are part of that festival really bring a lot of opposition to Bob Dylan, saying you can't bring electric guitars in here. That's not what we're about. And it doesn't seem like that big of a problem considering it's 1965. I mean, the Beatles are releasing Help at this point. They're about 5 to 6 albums in. You'd think at some point that the fight to preserve whatever folk used to be in America wouldn't be that big of a deal, right? Uh, they don't have that big of a problem to kind of try to tear apart here. And there's a moment you can see it in the trailer pretty easily when Bob Dylan says like, "Hey, play it louder," because they are really not taking to this kind of new sound. It seems to kind of fall flat, especially when you've seen Elvis's concerts when they're worried about the way he's moving and they're dealing with segregated crowds and people kind of getting together earlier about, 7 years earlier. This problem that the Dylan movie talks about doesn't seem as critical or as heavy or as meaningful when you watch this film. The other thing that kind of really stuck out to me was I didn't really know Bob Dylan as an artist before I went to go see this movie. I knew him on the fringes, and when I say on the fringes, I knew him through the Beatles, right, and through George Harrison's solo career. I knew him as a traveling Wilbury, right? I knew him from Peter and the Monkey Man, We're Harder for Cash, right? Those songs. I knew him from If Not For You, right? That was on the All Things Must Pass album. I knew, obviously, he had written some of the, best songs ever that had been covered by other people. Knocking on Heaven's Door by Eric Clapton, To Make You Feel My Love, which was released by Billy Joel before Bob Dylan released his version, probably more commonly known now by Adele's version of To Make You Feel My Love, right? I knew he was a prolific songwriter, but I didn't know much about the person himself. And this movie doesn't really hold back any kind of punches in terms of letting you know that Bob Dylan is not really an endearing character, and so he's hard to root for, right? He cheats on his in the very beginning of the movie. He cheats on the woman he's living with at the time with somebody else so quickly, not even a thought. Joan Baez calls him a jerk in the trailer, right? He is very kind of aloof and indifferent. There's a whole trend on social media right now of people just acting like Bob Dylan, kind of acting like a jerk. The movie doesn't really try to sugarcoat Bob's seemingly dramatized personality. And it makes it kind of a hard watch because normally when you watch a movie, you tend to kind of grow attached to the character. In this case, you kind of grow away from the character by the end of it, and you kind of find yourself not caring, which I think is kind of hard to string that along and do I want to see let's put it this way. Do I want to see a second Bob Dylan movie? No. I'm very much thoroughly done with this character. And I'm not quite sure if they were trying to dramatize him to be a mysterious, kind of like introverted, thoughtful kind of guy, and it just came across as being a jerk, or they're trying to take some of his moments, like, recently, they said it at the end of the film. This is not a spoiler, but he didn't show up to the Nobel Peace Prize when he was given it for his lyrics and for his poetry. And maybe they were trying to make a statement that Bob Dylan kind of seems like an iconoclast, right? He kind of seems like somebody who just doesn't want to associate. And so they were trying to get that across, that he has not just become that person over time. He was that person from the very, very beginning, right? He doesn't have that affable personality that a Paul McCartney had, that an Elvis had, right? Where he was face first. Bob Dylan was very much behind the scenes. I mean, hell, half of his songs, right, including Blowing in the Wind, were covered by other people before he actually got an opportunity to release it, right? He was that much behind the scenes. It kind of reminded me of It kind of reminded me of the Carole King musical, which Beautiful, I believe it was called, that depicted how she started off as a songwriter for the studios, and eventually she became more face first. As eventually these songs started coming to her, and it was like, screw it, I'm not going to let the Ronettes cover this song anymore. I'm going to do it myself. And her writing partnership with Jerry Geffen, Geffen. it reminded me of that a lot. The movie itself, too long. It's a little long in the tooth. You realize that without like a major conflict, and I worry about this for a lot of other band like biopics or biopics, whatever you want to call them, is that without an inherent problem, it's hard to hold on for more than 2 hours. We're going to talk about another movie later on in the show, in Sonic 3. I know it's a totally different kind of uh, movie, but an animated flick, and it's for kids, and it needs to be fast paced. But the pace of that movie is completely on point. It never stops going from beat to beat to beat. It doesn't stay too long in one area. In this particular movie, I don't know if they felt like they needed to stay longer in the area so you could feel like you were in beats, in moments, to feel like you were part of the world a little bit, or to kind of set that context. But it tended to drag a little bit because there wasn't really a critical point of conflict that you could attach yourself to, that you got invested in. I hope that makes sense. One of the great things about this film is the costuming. I mean, you honestly believe that these people who are playing these people, who they're supposed to be playing, right? I mean, Timothée Chalamet does a great job sounding, looking, and being Bob Dylan, right? You end up hating this character because Timothée Chalamet is bringing something to the character that makes you hate him, right? Ed Norton does a great job kind of representing that old guard of folk music, along with Woody Guthrie, who's kind of in the hospital in this entire film. Elle Fanning does a great job as Sylvia Russo, right? She's that first love interest that he's introduced to. And they do a great job kind of putting you in the context of the world and making you kind of miss aspects of that world. And what I talk about is not the conflict that's obviously going on in the 60s in the 60s, but I'm talking about like going to an open mic and going to the bitter end, or going to some of these, the music box, or whatever these clubs are that they're playing. The vibe and the look of these places. Obviously, it's a movie. They're going to make them look as desirable as possible, but it makes you miss that kind of playing, right? As a musician who's done a couple of those things before in different in different versions of those clubs, but also in New York City, it makes you miss the vibe of everyone paying attention to an acoustic number, right? There used to be a place in what was it called? Eddie's Attic or something like that in Atlanta, that had one in Decatur, right? And they had a vibe that was very similar to an acoustic, the acoustic folk kind of scene, and everybody would kind of pay attention to you playing two songs at an open mic. The movie does an excellent job setting you in those types of scenes, and then it kind of plods a little bit because it goes from festival to festival to festival to festival, and just to showcase the music, because that's what this movie is essentially made for, right? It's made to be an expose of Bob Dylan's music, right? Make no mistake that this movie is made to sell records, right? I mean, I did the same thing after coming out of this movie. I said, the movie was okay, right? But I'm more interested in trying to find the freewheeling Bob Dylan, right? I'm more interested to try to find Highway 61, records that they make a point to kind of push, right? And listen to it, whether it's on streaming or trying to find the old vinyl, right? Which was very surprising to me, and I'm not sure if I just missed the rush of records that were produced alongside this movie, but I couldn't find one vinyl, one representation of the old records in any of the stores, and I'm not sure if I missed the wave, or if they just missed an opportunity of like, well, this movie's coming out. Surely the old record label can make some money by putting out reproductions of these albums that they're shouting out. And I couldn't find one bit. I'm actually going to go probably later today to an old record store to see if I can find an old copy, because I couldn't find anything that was representative of this movie. And I thought that was maybe a missed opportunity. But maybe, just maybe, they sold out. I mean, that could be a possibility as well. So that said, I am glad I saw the movie. It's a little long in the tooth. It's a good movie. It will make you appreciate the music of the folk scene of the 1960s. It is excellently uh, depicted by the actors. It's you believe that you're watching Bob Dylan. And that being said, if you put a curly wig and sunglasses on anyone, I believe they do become Bob Dylan. And a leather jacket. I think that's all it takes in the costuming department. But it's a good movie to see if you're not familiar with Bob Dylan's music. I think that's where it really shines, right? You start realizing, oh wow, there's this whole catalog of folk music maybe that you haven't been exposed to that really do have some gems on it, especially the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which to me really stood out as an album because, especially compared to today, that album is like 12 to 13 tracks of all acoustic music. There's like not one bit of drum. There's not one bass. There's nothing. There's just Bob and a guitar on that album for 12 tracks. I mean, you would not see anything like that today. You wouldn't see anything as risky as that published today in today's music industry. It just wouldn't happen, right? So it's a relic of its time now, as it was when it was released, right? So for that reason alone, and I think that's the only reason that they would want to make a movie like this, right? Is to sell more records and give more exposure. Go see this movie. I'm excited, but also a little bit. I have to keep my expectations in check for other, biopics about musicians that I care about, especially this rumored Beatles one that's coming up because, I really liked the Baz Luhrmann Elvis, even though it got panned, right? Because I thought stylistically they made a choice, right? They really made it out there, and they made visually spectacular as Elvis tended to be. With this particular one, I felt like they kind of stayed a little bit more grassroots, a little bit more real, because that's what Bob Dylan's music is. And I was really impressed by the performance. But when you talk about something like the Beatles, right, where everybody and their brother has like a Beatles impression, and there have been Beatles movies before that that are terribly acted, you do get a little bit worried about the performance of something like that, right? That we've heard Paul McCartney so many times in life. We've heard John Lennon clips for a long time. We've heard George Harrison, Ringo talk for a long time. That anything is going to seem like a pale comparison. That's why I was actually so surprised by this Bob Dylan one. And maybe it's just because my ear's not trained to Bob Dylan's voice as much, but I thought Timothée Chalamet's performance was excellent, and it made you really feel like you were watching Bob Dylan. I get scared at what a Beatles movie could be, especially considering they're talking about making a Beatles movie and 4 other solo movies, which might be a little bit ambitious. But anyways, go see this movie. This movie is a fun affair. It made me actually kind of look at the folk festival schedule coming up here, or last year rather, to see if what they were fearing in the movie actually kind of came true. And they were very, very much hesitant about, putting up electric acts and stuff in the 60s. And I was curious myself, I'm like, 60 years later, right, what do these acts look like? And you know what? They still do keep, according to some of these acts, they still keep it pretty folky, right? It's not, there are some acts here that are a little bit, a little bit harder than others and stuff like that, but they really do, Conan O'Brien and real musicians there. They do keep it pretty faithful. It obviously evolved over time, and that's why it's, again, not to bang on a drum about the same point, but when they're talking about like, we can't have electric music up there that's loud, right? It felt like very much like, oh, well, this festival won't survive as it did now for 60 years without it evolving at some point. So it's interesting. So I mean, go look at some of the acts that they had last year and give your opinion here and let me know if this if they've remained true to their initial statement here about keeping it folk like, which it seems like they did. I mean, there are some other acts, but how are you going to survive if you don't adapt, right? Anyways, that is a complete unknown by Timothy Chalamet, Ed Norton, and Elle Fanning, acted by. Go see the movie, and it was a it's long in the tooth and stuff like that, but still worth seeing. I think they could have kind of tightened it up.